Welcome to the Forest Over Story podcast. This podcast explores forest stewardship in the Pacific Northwest, helping landowners and professionals gain new insights and information in the field of forest management. The Forest Over Story is a product of the Washington State University Extension Forestry Program and is supported by the Washington Department of Natural Resources and the Society of American Foresters. All right, welcome back, listeners. I hope you're enjoying the last few weeks of summer as we head into fall. We're back today with another great episode. As usual, I'm your host, Patrick Schultz, Extension Forester with Washington State University. My usual co-host, Kevin Zobris, is out today, so I'm hosting solo. We're going to discuss something that's very important to all Washingtonians, especially this time of year, and that is wildfire. But we're going to add a little twist and talk specifically about wildfire in Western Washington and how communities can prepare for it. So I am joined by an excellent guest, Jenny Coe, who is the Community and Wildfire Resilience Coordinator with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. And she's the coordinator for Western Washington, so she's the exact right person to hash this topic out with. Jenny, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks, Patrick. I appreciate the opportunity to be here chatting with you all today.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you on. I've had you on my list for a while. I think even before I told you, I'd been waiting to reach out to you and talk about this because Western Washington wildfire, especially for me being located on the west side, is just something that I'm very interested in talking about and digging into. But the best place to start, as usual, I always just like to get a little bit more into the background of our guests. So, can you tell us a little bit about where you're coming from and how you came to work with the DNR and what your expertise is?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I am a resident of Bellingham, and I actually graduated from Western Washington University through their environmental college. And I did get a degree focused on natural resources management. So I'm actually using my 4-year degree, if you can believe
Nice.
that. I know that doesn't happen all the time.
Hmm.
Um, but my career actually started with the conservation districts. I was hired, I don't know, 20 plus years ago to work for the Skagit Conservation District and then later for the Whatcom Conservation District. And while I was working with the conservation districts, I was kind of focused early on in, watershed health education and, working on riparian restoration and all things sort of natural resource related. Um, but I hadn't really had an opportunity or necessarily really thought about sort of forest health or wildfire issues to any, degree. And we had our Department of Natural Resources fire prevention person from our region come into our office one day. This was back in 2005, I think. He came into the office and said, "Hey, we are really trying to start working on getting some education and program opportunities out to residents of Skagit County to help them better understand our wildfire risk. And the conservation districts have a good rapport and trust with landowners, both rural and urban, and forest landowners. And we were thinking you could help us deliver this program, and that just sort of fell to me. Because I think at the time my boss was like, oh, she's somebody who likes working with the public and doing outreach education, so we will hand this to her. And so I pretty much learned everything I know about wildfire preparedness, forest health on the job, interestingly, um, and have built uh, programs around wildfire preparedness and education since that point with a good mentor and a partner, a forester partner at the conservation district. So long story short, I was there with the conservation districts for about 20 years and helping build wildfire programs at other conservation districts around the state until last year. And I took this position as the community resilience coordinator with DNR just over a year ago. So it's a relatively new position for me, but it's a lot of very similar work, but on a broader scale, and obviously from a different employer perspective.
That's awesome. I didn't realize that you were with the conservation districts for so long before. That probably prepared you really well for this job.
Yeah, we work a lot. Not to get into too much detail in this direction, but we do. DNR does work very closely with conservation districts, and
Right.
they really are one of our closest partners in this wildfire resilience work. So it is really handy to have had that experience there for so long. Um, prior to coming to DNR and filling this role.
Yeah, that's awesome. So now you're the coordinator for all of the West Side, and I know, like you said, you're still working with the conservation districts a lot. What else is there to this job? Like, what's the meat of your day to day?
Yeah, great question. Well, first I'll start with the fact that there are 7 of us coordinators around the state. So
Oh,
I'm one of 7. And I mean, we're a relatively new team, basically as of a year ago, a little over a year ago. So we're placed throughout the state, and we each serve a certain set of counties. And actually, right now, Western Washington is a little, very large area to cover for one person. So I do have our coordinator, who's based out of Yakima, is actually covering the southwest corner of Western Washington for me because it's just, it takes a long time to get there. I'm obviously up in Bellingham. So he's covering that portion for me, and I just have the rest of Western Washington, which is still a very large area with a lot of people. Um, so that's kind of the area I'm focused on. But I our basically our mission or our vision for the community resilience team around the state is really to inspire and empower individuals and communities really to coexist with wildfire. And that's through listening and advocating for community based solutions. And that's kind of the canned answer a little bit. But essentially, if you were to break it down to a day to day sort of picture of what we do, it is really providing support for our local partners. So, ensuring they have funding and training that they need to help deliver wildfire preparedness education and resources to communities and individuals. Um, and we're really working, I mean, besides supporting our local partners, we're working at all scales from helping an individual landowner better understand their risk and what they can do about it, all the way up to working with a county to help them develop a community wildfire protection plan. So I can talk a little bit more detail about what those are later in our conversation, but it's a pretty wide range of services and resources we provide, and it's a it's just it's kind of like wherever our constituents are at, wherever the entity or the person or the community is currently at in their wildfire adaptation efforts is where we meet them, and we do our best to help them build that out.
I like that a lot. I'm always going to be in favor of a sort of ground up approach rather than top down. And I like that you're, like what you said, meeting them where they're at and then helping them go the rest of the way. I think that's a really effective strategy.
Yeah.
Um, I think, yeah. So before we dig too deep into, you know, how DNR and you and your programs are addressing the problem, we should talk a little bit about, I guess, what the problem is in Western Washington in regards to wildfire. I know you and I have talked about this. I've talked about this with a lot of foresters and landowners in this region about how different wildfire looks in Western Washington compared to Eastern Washington. and how that cultural perception, though, maybe isn't entirely up to date because we're often reading a lot of information about fire on the east side and reading about what the solutions are there, both from an ecological perspective, but even from like a community perspective. The forests look different here and the communities look different here. So, maybe we can touch a little bit, starting with, how is fire different in the west side compared to the east side?
Well, that's a great question. And first, I want to offer the disclaimer that I'm not a fire ecologist.
Right,
So
we can
I'm going
do
to
the
give the general overview here, but
sure.
I think I'll start with um, first of all, being on the west. I grew up on the west side of the state um, for my whole life, basically, and in working in this field for the last 15 plus years, I've witnessed a lot of uh, changes, I would say, over the last 5 or 6 years. So I want to talk about that, but in general, like the way the way that fire occurs, let's just say on the east side of the state, is different than on the west side of the state, because the timing between fires, or what we call the fire return interval, is much shorter on the east side of the state. So we're talking like 5 to 30 years between major fires, right? And it's a known entity. It is something that has had a lot of attention, a lot of resources put to it, a lot of research put into it, as far as like, how do
Right.
we manage that? What have we done wrong in the past? What can we do better in the future? How can we adapt to, a changing environment? How do we deal with these catastrophic wildfires, both at a, landscape management scale and a community scale? And so there's been a lot of attention and resources for a long time on the east side of the state around managing wildfire. On the west side, it's different because we have a different environment, we have different types of fuels, and our timing between large scale fires is a range of like 200 to 400 years, maybe sometimes more. So it's not often something that we see in our lifetime, right? It's not in our faces, it's not something we've been used to dealing with on a regular basis. So it isn't, what I like to say, in our face necessarily, right? And so the and we have to recognize that the forests on, the east side of the Cascades are different than the forests on the west side of the Cascades. Our forests are very productive. They grow back really fast. Um, and you know the treatment methods that we use on the east side of the state aren't necessarily always going to be um, useful or as effective on the west side of the state. So really, we need to kind of take a little bit different angle when we're talking about managing wildfire. And I don't want to get into too much detail on that, but what I will say is that um, we while we don't see fire very often in large scale on the west side, we are overdue for a
Right.
large scale fire. And I think over the last 6 plus years, maybe 6 to 7 years or so, the awareness around wildfire has really risen due to, I think, a lot of different factors we're seeing play out, like extreme weather events like the heat dome.
Yeah.
We're seeing smoke in the air that's affecting our day to day activities and our health. We're now having summers where we're like, okay, we're planning a family vacation to go somewhere, and is it going to be smoky? I just had a family vacation up in British Columbia, and we ended up having to stay in the house for almost a day and a half and not go out and play on the water and not go hiking because the smoke was so bad. So we're talking about like things that are affecting our day-to-day lives in Western Washington that are making us think about wildfire and what we can do about it, how to be better prepared for it. We saw fires in 2020 on the west side We saw the Bolt Creek fire last year, and there's been, a ton of media coverage on all of this stuff. Not
Yeah.
just, things that are happening on the west side, but things that are happening around our country. There's a ton of media coverage right now. So I guess what I'm getting to in a long-winded way is that I do think over the last 5 years or so, we are really starting to pay more attention to wildfire as a big issue on the west side, and making decisions about, okay, and doing research on what is going to be the best management tactics for, reducing wildfire risk in our, communities and in our landscapes. And I think for Western Washington landscapes, we're seeing, as far as like forest health goes and managing forests, I think the focus really needs to be on forest health in general,
Right.
and fire is a component of that, but it isn't maybe like the number one thing we're looking at when we're talking about forest health, right? But a healthy forest is a forest that's going to be more resilient to fire. So, we're seeing effects from drought, we're seeing stressed trees from heat. um, there's issues that are affecting our forest health on the west side that can lead to, disease and bug infestation and dead trees and all this stuff that's really happening right now, and that makes our forests more susceptible to fire. So there are management techniques that are appropriate for the west side that are different from, what might happen on the east side, both on the forest management end and then on the community end.
I
um,
couldn't agree more. I just want to say, I think,
yeah.
working in extension, we're always trying to navigate landowner objectives, and that's how we ultimately support. It's like what you said earlier, meeting them where they're at, and then kind of helping them get the rest of the way. And where they're at is always different depending on what their objectives are, and that still applies to wildfire resilience. But the number one thing should always be forest health, and that's the one landowner objective that everyone will have in common. I think wildfire resilience is probably another one that everyone will have in common. Um, but it also includes meeting the forest where it's at and understanding that ecology, as you said, and the differences between west side, east side, and how, it might not make sense to go and park out your forest like a beautiful dry ponderosa pine stand and try to do prescribed burns. It looks a little different on the west side. So I'm just glad I really liked your assessment of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I do want to talk a little bit more about specifics on, the if you have, trees or, small acreage forest or even large acreage forest. I do want to talk more specifics about, where to focus your energy, maybe later on in the conversation. But
Sure.
one thing I want to add real quick is that I think this is a positive thing, is that our politicians and our government decision makers are also really paying attention to increased wildfire risk on the west side and the need for resources to support agencies and local entities that are helping landowners, as well as, direct resources for communities and individual landowners. And that support is, like, right now better than I've ever seen it. There are more resources available than I've ever seen for residents on the west side to better understand their risk and to actually do something about it. And that's everywhere from the federal level to the state level to the local level. So I think, the fact that we are seeing more fire on the west side and our risk is increasing, which I might talk about too a little bit further, um, is that we are seeing positive things play out at the decision making level, as far as, having resources available to support people in their adaptation to wildfire.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know just at the state level, one example was that House Bill 1168 a couple years ago, a historic amount of money for forest health and wildfire. And I believe, did some of that go to fund your program?
Yes, actually,
Yeah.
House Bill 1168 is the funding source that supports the community resilience team, our
Hmm.
existence. Um, Efforts on the west side prior to right now, we're actually also supported by a separate budget proviso that was created. And I that was kind of more specific to a certain program that I'll talk about in a minute. But in general, yeah, that House Bill 1168 is one of the biggest funding resources and mechanisms for getting these resources out to people and supporting funding of community action.
Yeah, and I apologize to the listeners for getting into the legislature, but it was, it's just a fascinating process, and it's really, like you said, it's very encouraging and exciting to see that it seems like a lot of people are on the same page within the political realm that this is a big issue that requires support. I want to touch on something just kind of quickly, and I think the answer maybe is a little obvious, but I want to get your take on it. The population dynamics between Eastern Washington and Western Washington are different, and has that, do you think, fed into why West Side's getting suddenly more attention when you have huge hubs like obviously Seattle, but big towns like Issaquah up in the woods, surrounded by forest. Is that population dynamic of just being denser feeding into all this additional support?
Yeah, I mean, we do have we have a lot of population on the west side, and that dense population and that how we've developed our landscapes on the west side in those more forested areas that are continuing to grow in population and continuing to build in those, what we call wildland urban interfaces, which is
Hmm.
basically where our built environment meets our natural environment. Um, is those are the areas that are getting a lot of attention because they are at higher risk typically, and there's a lot of people there. And one of the big issues that I think we have on the west side is going to be evacuation.
Yeah.
Um, and I I'm hoping that in the increased interest for resources and education, there will be a component of, you know, planning at the county level and at more of the small scale, like fire district or neighborhood level around evacuation planning and what that looks like. And a lot of times that piece is prompted by, active homeowners within a community that say, hey, we recognize that we have this risk and we are concerned about evacuation and we want to come up with a plan. And a lot of that, I think, is not just evacuation planning, but communication among neighbors and what that looks like between, a neighborhood or community and the you know the county sheriff's office or the emergency management office or the local fire district or the police, whatever it is. But evacuation is, I think, going to be a big issue on the west side just because there are so many people and we have a lot of these developments that are, up in areas like North Bend and Issaquah, as you just described.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Sometimes driving up I-90 and looking at those towns, I can't help but notice just how, I mean, it's beautiful. It's why people want to live there. They're tucked away in the forest like that, but there's obviously some problems associated with that, especially as we see increased risk of wildfire in Western Washington. You started talking about something, and I kind of deterred you from it, so I apologize. But you mentioned like in the last 5 to 10 years, you've started to notice some changes that have increased that risk. Do you want to talk a little more to that?
There's been a lot of research and the research I've been finding very useful is coming out of the UW Climate Impacts Group. They've done a lot of in-depth studies on wildfire risk and whether it's increasing in Western Washington. And basically, the bottom line is yes, well, wildfire risk is increasing in Western Washington, and it is due to increasing temperatures in the summer, less rain in the summer. Our snow is melting earlier, which means we have less water or moisture available for our vegetation, our forests. So those things combined are basically equal drier forests and drier fuels. And we're having these, longer fire seasons that we're seeing and more acres burned. So we know that risk is increasing. We have these drier fuels and drier forests. So basically, what we have is conditions that are more ripe for wildfire, is how we describe it. You still need an ignition source, right, to kick off a wildfire. And so, in that aspect, we're kind of focused on human behavior and or weather conditions that might start cause lightning or something, which is less of an issue on the west side. Most of our fires are human caused. So um, there's the sort of the human behavior piece, right? Are we going to have an ignition source at the wrong time?
Right.
And then a key ingredient to historically to large wildfires on the west side is this east wind event. And that's something that occurs typically late summer, early September, right around right now. And what happens is we get a hot, dry wind from the east side of the Cascades that comes over to the west side and really like dries everything out and gets a wind speed velocity going that can, if there's an ignition source and everything's really dried out, it will just pick it up and run. And that's historically the sort of the recipe for large west side fires. What we don't know right now is whether those east wind events are going to increase due to our changing climate. That's kind of a question mark right now. If there's new research out on it, I haven't seen it, but as far as I know, that's kind of a question mark. Will we see those east wind events more or less or the same? But either way, we still have those conditions that are sort of more suited for fire to start and to spread.
Right. Yeah, and I believe mid-August we had some red flag warnings in Western Washington. And for those that aren't aware, what's usually behind those red flag warnings is that dry east wind and hot temperatures,
Yes.
unless I'm mistaken.
Nope, that's correct.
Yeah.
Um, and that is something that when I talk about what kinds of solutions are there, one of the things I like to bring up for residents is paying attention to those weather warnings and reports, because you will get the red flag warnings from time to time in the summer, and those are the conditions that are basically the perfect lineup of, if you're going to have a big fire, it is during those conditions. So following restrictions and rules around what you should not be doing during those
Right.
red flag warning times is really, really important.
Right. That's the perfect segue. And I also want to apologize because I think I promised you that we wouldn't talk too much about the technical side of fire. I appreciate you indulging me and explaining it so well. But what we really wanted to dig into today was, what your program does and sort of the solutions, like you just said, and, how are you approaching this, building community resilience. So yeah, I mean that red flag warning is a huge piece. The few wildfire classes I've taught, I've said the same thing. Just keep an eye on the weather and be ready. Be
Yes.
ready when those red flag warnings are out. How are you going about communicating that to the broader public? Because that's not just forest owners.
Right, right.
It's more than that.
Yeah. And actually, we are targeting rural landowners, forest landowners, suburban landowners, and even in
Hmm.
some cases, urban landowners. And not to, bring the conversation to something heartbreaking, but you see what's happened in Maui
Yeah.
and in past fires like the Marshall Fire and out of Colorado, and other fires where it may start as what we kind of identify as a wildfire and it turns into an urban conflagration, which is basically when you have structures that are on fire that are, because they're so close together, they're transferring fire from one structure to the next. And it becomes less of a wildfire situation and more of an urban conflagration situation. So we are recognizing that that is something that needs some attention as well. But that's kind of a side note there. So as far as what our programs are doing and some of the solutions, I would say we're it's important to recognize that the solutions happen at multiple scales, right? So
Right.
I would start like at the government level. You mentioned the House Bill 1168 earlier. There was another, sorry to get into this again, another bill that passed recently or this spring. It was House Bill and Senate Bill 1578, which puts additional funds towards this work in specifically in Western Washington, and there's some other pieces to that. But just the empowerment from at the government level to support agencies and local organizations that provide these resources to the public is really important. Like I just said, Washington State's doing a pretty good job of that right now with passing these bills that continue to support this work, both through DNR and through the Conservation Commission to our conservation districts and other entities. The feds are doing a pretty good job right now of this too. There's in the infrastructure bill, there was a grant called the Community Wildfire Defense Grant. I'm not going to go into details on that, but essentially it's federal funding that supports wildfire preparedness and planning efforts, many different scales, including, supporting education efforts and writing community wildfire protection plans. So those are kind of at both the federal and state level. There's good support there right now, and that is one of the pieces of this solution. um, at the more local level, I would say, for people like me and the partners that I work with around Western Washington, it's continuing to build partnerships to kind of make sure that we're sharing unified messages around what it means to be prepared for wildfire and ways to do that. And then building, capacity within our local organizations to provide access to those resources for the public. So beyond that, well, I guess one other piece of that I will say kind of at the local level is what I've mentioned a couple times now is those community wildfire protection plans, or for short, if we're using our acronyms, it's CWPP. Um, there is some focus right now on developing those, especially in Western Washington. Those typically happen at the county scale, but really, what's essential about those plans is that there's been collaboration between stakeholders around and the public around planning for wildfire, identifying and prioritizing where the risk areas are, and making a list of mitigation strategies of how within that county we're going to address those issues. And having that plan in place and going through that process is really a huge piece, foundational piece to making things happen and finding funding to support actions to reduce wildfire within a county. So that's kind of like the government, county level agency scale efforts, right?
Right.
And then when you get down to more of the homeowner landowner scale, this is really important because while the agencies and government employees and all that stuff, local organizations can do all this work, we really need the landowners, the homeowners, the residents to recognize their role in this because it's really important. And without their participation in these efforts, we don't get very far, right, in helping them save homes and manage their forests and all that stuff. So the things at the homeowner landowner scale that I would say are most important to focus on are really, as I mentioned before, paying attention to those weather warnings, those red flag warning days, um, signing up for emergency alerts through your county. Most counties, if not all counties, have some sort of emergency alert system in place where you can get alerts through your phone, your cell phone, your email, whatever. You can, I think there's ways to choose how you get that messaging, but you'll get information about red flag warnings, burn ban restrictions.
Hmm.
Um, you know, being ready if there is a fire, making sure you have your what we call emergency go bag together, which Embarrassingly, I do not have one. I
Me
shouldn't even
either.
be admitting this, but you know how that goes, right? Preach, preach, preach.
Yep.
I have my list of what I need to go purchase, but I haven't actually put it together.
Same.
So
Yep.
maybe this is a note to ourselves after this podcast. Let's follow through on
Absolutely.
our to-do list. Um, and then lastly is really take advantage of the programs and the resources that are out there to help you as a landowner know what you can do on your property to reduce that risk, whether it's, you know, helping manage your forest so it can be healthier and more resistant to fire, to understanding what you can do in your landscape to make it more fire resistant, to understanding how to make your structures more fire resistant. So taking advantage of those resources, I think, is really important. Because the more you do, at your property ahead of time, the more likely it is to survive a fire. Or if there are resources available to help protect your home, it makes it safer for them to be there.
Yeah, I really appreciate that breakdown. I think one thing we definitely need to do is collect some links to put in the description of this podcast episode so people can, um, refer to those and
Yes.
maybe put your email in there too if you're willing.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, so people can reach out. I was hoping to get some information on one specific program that I've been hearing about that's available in certain areas of Western Washington. It's not available everywhere, but the Wildfire Ready Neighbors program. Can you tell us a little more about what that is?
I would love to. I was hoping you would ask me that. I know I've kind of been talking at the more general scale, so now I
Sure.
want to kind of dive into some of the programs that are available for folks and where I think in Western Washington we really need to focus our efforts. So, the Wildfire Ready Neighbors program is a, a DNR program, but it is executed in partnership with conservation districts, fire districts, county emergency management folks, WSU Extension. Um, any local partners that have a stake in wildfire are typically engaged in I feel like executing is not the right word. Delivering this program, um, and it is the Wildfire Ready Neighbors program is essentially uh, it's a portal, it's a website. So just to throw this out there right at the beginning, the website for Wildfire Ready Neighbors is wildfireready.com. And it's a way to it's an outreach campaign, it's an ad campaign, it's a way to get landowners to come to a central location on a website and get information about how to reduce risk and specific actions they can take on their property to reduce that risk. It also, in areas where this program, and when I say areas, I really mean counties, where this program has been launched, and an ad campaign has been behind it and an outreach effort has been behind it. In those areas, people that go to the website within that county can not only get a free wildfire ready plan that has the actions they can take on their property, but they can also sign up for a what we call a wildfire ready home visit, which is actually a wildfire risk assessment of your property, or a forest health consultation. And those services are provided by one of the partners that is engaged in launching the program. So it can be, wildfire staff from DNR that comes out to provide that service. It can be a staff person from your local conservation district. And it could be somebody from one of your fire district, your local fire district. So we've been working really closely with our partners to help provide these services to people when they request it. And right now, that program has officially been launched in, I think, if you look at the map of Washington, I won't list every county, but pretty much all of the counties in central Washington and in Spokane. And then it's also on the west side. This last spring was launched in Mason, Thurston, and Pierce counties. So if you're a resident of any of those three counties on the west side, you can go to the website and you can sign up to have a wildfire risk assessment of your property or a forest health consultation. And the forest health consultation piece is something that's specifically, I think, for the most part, provided by our DNR forest resiliency staff.
Hmm.
And the one thing that's cool about that forest health consultation is that um, not only are you getting, advice, but they could also tell you about the cost share program that's available to forest landowners, which is pretty cool because it provides cost share for you to actually implement some of the things that they're recommending. So um, so that website is available really to anybody that wants to go to it, but it is, statewide. Anybody can go to this website and at least get the information. In places where we've rolled out the program specifically in the counties I mentioned, you can actually request services. So um, it's a good way of really getting the interest of an individual to take action on their property and getting them the help and the resources they need to be able to do that. So the other thing that is great about this Wildfire Ready Neighbors program is that it can also be sort of a, a gateway to larger scale programs like the Firewise program. Because
Mm.
one of the questions I get a lot, which I don't know, Patrick, if this is floating around in your head or not, but it comes up a lot when we talk about this program, is a lot of people have heard about the Firewise USA program because it's been around for a long time.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, how is that different from the Firewise program, or how do they work together? So this program is not it, they complement each other essentially. So what happens a lot of times is through, ad campaigns and a lot of, effort by the partners to let people know about the Wildfire Ready Neighbors program, we get interest, concentrated interest within maybe a neighborhood where a number of people in the same neighborhood have said, hey, I want you to come out and give me, this advice for my property. Well, it turns out, a bunch of their neighbors are interested too. And then they say, hey, how can we, work together as neighbors in this community to address wildfire? And that's kind of opens the door for talking about the Firewise USA program, which is more targeted to like the neighborhood scale efforts.
Sure.
So while Wildfire Ready Neighbors has the word neighbors in it, the way it functions is more targeted towards an individual. The Firewise USA program is a recognition program for the neighborhood as a whole. Um, and a lot of times what happens, what we've seen over this last year is you might have a community that's been involved in the Firewise program for a number of years, and they hear about the Wildfire Ready Neighbors program, and they say, "Oh, well, we're doing all this neighborhood scale work, work to make our forests healthier and chipping projects and things like that, but we haven't really had like these focused on our individual properties where we're actually, what can we do to our structures and our landscaping? We haven't had an assessment of that." So we can use the Wildfire Ready Neighbors program as a tool to get, individual property owners to start knowing what they need to do on their property within a Firewise community. So, they really work well. Really work nicely together. And DNR is sort of the administration behind both the Wildfire Ready Neighbors program and the Firewise program within Washington State. So there, without getting into too much detail, there are a ton of resources associated with both of those programs.
Right.
And as Patrick said, we'll be sharing some links and my contact here, if you so that you can access some of those resources and learn more about what you can do on your property and within your neighborhood.
That's awesome. And I was absolutely going to ask about what's available at the community scale. And I really like the way that those two could complement each other because as we talked about in the beginning, um, a top-down approach to community resilience would be probably really difficult. Um, I've had a couple chances, just like a side story, of working on forest stewardship plans in HOAs,
Hmm.
where one person decided that the whole HOA decided that the whole HOA needed a plan, but didn't get the other landowners on board first. So it became very complicated, very tricky to navigate all that. If you
Yeah.
have people on board first and on the same page through the Wildfire Ready Neighbors program, I imagine it would make adoption of the Firewise community program much easier. I don't know if that's been your experience, but
Yeah, it definitely can. The one thing though about the Firewise program is it's kind of recognized that it can be very difficult, especially if you have a large community. It can be very difficult to get buy-in from every single homeowner in a community. So
sure,
when a community engages in the Firewise program, it's kind of looked at as a continuing ongoing effort to bring more people in the neighborhood into, knowing about the program, knowing about, projects or resources available in the community through the Firewise program. So it's kind of a growing, expanding thing, knowing that typically not everybody in the neighborhood is necessarily going to know about it or care. Sometimes there's
right.
people that just don't have the time, and they don't it's not a priority for them. So it's a kind of a growth mindset type of program when it kicks off. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Can't win them all, so to speak.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yep. Very true.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on and talking. And as you said, we'll definitely get some resources in the description, so that you're some links to follow, and Jenny's email, so you can, if any interested listeners want to reach out to her and learn more, that would be a great way to start. But as you mentioned, the wildfireready.com, that's another great place to start digging into some resources. The DNR also has a DNR, a landowner assistance portal. So I don't know the website address offhand, but if you Google DNR landowner assistance portal, I'm sure it'll take you there. And that's where you could learn more about the forest health assessments that Jenny was mentioning.
Yes.
Um, and of course, I'm just going to shamelessly plug forestry.wsu.edu to learn about any events happening in your neck of the woods, by any of our extension foresters. But Jenny, did I miss anything? Do you have any final thoughts before we sign off?
Well, I'm looking, I glanced over at my notes for today, and I realized that I did miss one thing that I
Well, go for it.
wanted to share. And I think, and I will share a link to this resource, but there's a fellow named Jack Cohen who he's retired now, but he is kind of the brains, or what we like to call the godfather behind sort of the Firewise concepts
Oh,
about
cool.
how to keep your home from burning in a wildfire. And he has a video that I'm going to share a link to that I think kind of captures the essential pieces of what you can do as a homeowner to really improve the survivability of your home. And it's really all about focusing on the structure, like your home, and its immediate surroundings. Because, as I'm going to quote Jack Cohen, and this is kind of a funny quote, but if your home doesn't ignite, it doesn't burn. So it's kind of a duh comment, but at the same time, it's like,
Yeah,
well, yeah, it's really that simple, right? So
I like that.
while we're talking about sort of the fuels management and forest health, and that's all very important, but if you're really dialing into the essential of, saving your home in a wildfire, your structure, using fire resistant materials on your structure, making sure there's not a lot of flammable materials or vegetation right up next to your structure within, the first 5 feet. That's where you want to start. And I didn't want to miss getting that message out, because it really is um, kind of the essential piece to focus on when you're talking about survivability of homes.
I think that's great, and I'll probably make that the title of this episode.
All right. I love it.
All right. Well, with that, then I think it's time for us to sign off. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this. And it should be September 1st today when this comes out. So that means there's a little bit time left and the wildfire seasons for you to do some work. And I hope you all have a safe rest of the wildfire season and enjoy the beginnings of fall. And Jenny, thank you again. I really appreciate you coming on and look forward to having you on again sometime.
Thank you, Patrick.